I'd like to welcome everybody to our next panel. It's a fireside chat, although we don't have the fire out. That was a building policy issue. But this panel is called Lessons, Challenges, and Opportunities. And I have two veterans in the field, also veterans of NAAHL. Both of them served as chairman of NAAHL. Joe for 10 years, maybe longer? 11 years. And he joined NAAHL really at the very beginning and has been a stalwart enthusiast and supporter for many, many years. Jack Markowski just preceded me as chair, had the job for at least 6 years. And both of them are recently retired from their careers. Joe at MHIC, the Massachusetts Housing Investment Council, and Jack from CIC. They both started in Chicago. They both had long careers in public service, all kinds of jobs throughout housing, and they're here today to give us some perspective. I feel like somebody on the previous panel said it's nice to have some perspective, so it's not just today's crisis, but a long view. So I want to start out, and I do want this to be conversational. Talk about the evolution of what you've seen in affordable housing. From when you started your careers, what were the tools? How was it done? How was it received in the communities? And what has that meant for that evolution? Either one of you.
I'm sure I'll start. I think both Jack and I started in the public sector, or we worked in the public sector before we took our jobs at MHIC or in Chicago at CIC. And I think that what's happened, and in our nonprofit jobs, we worked a lot with government, but the government role in affordable housing has changed a lot over the years. When I got started, it was largely the Section 8 new construction, substantial rehab program. The programs were driven by decision-making in Washington. It was very much of a top-down approach. Over time, the program, through the LIHTC program and other programs, the authority was delegated to the states, and that really changed a lot in terms of how things got done, sort of more local decision-making, and that was really the changing context for how things got done. I think I guess I'm going to mention the word context a lot because I think, in fact, a lot of what we do totally depends on the context, in which we're working, in terms of capital sources. The earlier panels talked a lot about what's going on politically, about what's going on in the economy, what's happening with interest rates. All of those things have affected a lot of what our responses have been over time. And I think to the extent I've been successful, it's been through adapting to the changing context and understanding that context in order to be successful. I guess that's my quick summary, but lots more to add.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would second what Joe said, and also when I came in the 1970s, I wasn't really, I was observing more than really acting, but I think reflecting on the last conversation here, that the last panel, this was what Joe said, it was centrally controlled, but the money, both the financing, but then the rental assistance, that we were seeing a number of projects. The basic formula was that you had rental insurance, mortgage insurance from the federal level, but you also had projects that assisted in the financing, but then also the ongoing operations of the project by providing project-based Section 8. And so that was all the way through the 70s and into the 80s, before that was knocked out by budget cutting and eventually replaced by the low-income housing tax credit. And with the tax credit, it was kind of like we're not going to be the federal government making the decision that we're not going to run the cash register completely without limits from here to kingdom come for rental assistance. And it was kind of like, I look at the tax credit program of being, we'll figure out ways to build this housing, you figure out how to operate it from here on out. And that very good production program, although there's issues with it, and as Joe said, it did decentralize it, but it was a definite move away from a commitment to ongoing rental assistance at the federal level, and more movements toward decision-making at the local levels.
Do you feel like devolving that decision-making has been helpful for acceptance of affordable units, for more state buy-in, for more community buy-in?
I think it's allowed for strategies which are more location specific. And so different places develop different strategies. In Massachusetts, also, the state created a lot of programs that partnered with it and encouraged the state to do that, and the state became a much more substantial partner as a result. One thing I would say about the shift that Jack mentioned is that also the earlier Section 8 program really had no market discipline at all. In other words, you could build a Section 8 new construction project anywhere. It's guaranteed to rent up. Everything's guaranteed. So there was nobody sort of saying, does this market need it? Is it going to work in that way? It was just a sort of guaranteed thing. Whereas the LifeTech program has a lot more market discipline built into it, which is good and bad. But it really fundamentally changed the way the programs operated and the way in which people looked at them. I also think that the LifeTech program, I mean, again, I sort of go back into the 70s as well. I think those earlier programs there's a history of federal housing programs going back to the 40s and 50s where there was historic, public housing, et cetera, The market discipline in the LifeTech and the current program really has ensured their long-term success because you've got private investors who are going to make sure it's successful. So I think bringing private parties in, having market discipline has really strengthened the program. I think it's strengthened the reputation of the program. The earlier programs, Section 8 program had, all the programs had scandals going back to the 60s. And I think that the LifeTech program has largely been scandal-free. I think it largely is viewed as a positive program. I think the banks being involved as investors, provides another voice advocating for the program, which didn't exist in the early programs. So I see the evolution on the public side as being largely positive.
The other thing that happened, I agree with all of that. There was also, not only was it better accepted locally, there was, it encouraged the localities to come up with their own resources. And so I think that as a result, there's all kinds of, I don't think anybody said you had to do that, but to make projects go, the tax credits didn't fund a project completely. And the localities ended up thinking, how can we use this when they figured out there's this federal resource? How can we use this to further our own community development ends? But then what resources can we put on the table too? And there's a whole panoply of resources that in our area evolved at the state level, at the city level, and just through private market, through city land, city fee waivers, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. So it encouraged those kinds of resources to come to the table as well.
Jack, just sort of pivoting now, I know that a lot of the work that you did with CIC was not on LifeTech properties. It was on small developers and developers of color, people in neighborhoods, and maybe not necessarily affordable, but talk us through that and how that affects those neighborhoods where you're not getting a LifeTech project, but where you're looking at the positive community development, and both from the developer and from the community's perspective, please.
Sure, and you said not all affordable in a controlled sense, but in the all affordable in the, as we say, the NOAA sense, the naturally occurring affordable housing, which is by far the greatest source of affordable housing in the country. As we did this, what the issues are, when you look at an area, CIC is in Chicago, and you look at the Chicago metropolitan area, the vast amount of the rental housing in Chicago is affordable by any measure. So if you said affordable to, basically it's almost all affordable to people with 50 to 80% of median income. That's the rental housing. I'd say 3/4 of the rental housing is affordable there. And so there's a whole marketplace there, and that's where we were active. And particularly, you have the greatest number in Chicago of low-priced units in the most challenging neighborhoods. And so an organization like ours, which is a CDFI, we ended up specializing in being able to lend to those areas and preserve that housing. A very big part of this, I know that we talk a lot about production, and the other side of it, we also talk about preservation, is preserving what's there. And this housing that was built more than 100 years ago provides the bulk of the housing through vast majorities of Chicago. And it's just you can lose that housing. We talk a lot about gentrification. And in the neighborhoods I'm talking about, there's not much of the housing that's lost through gentrification. I mean, very, very small amounts. For the most part, I always say it can be lost out the top end, lost through the bottom end. And it's lost through the bottom end through deterioration and disinvestment. And so you have this housing in our area. The challenge is to have vibrant neighborhoods, because there's no point in having, I said, there's no point in having a low-priced housing unit in a terrible place to live, and where it's dangerous, it's difficult to access a job, a low quality of life overall. So that at any rate, it's important to, it's very much tied with community development. It's important to keep investment going on in those communities. And as you said, Merilyn, primarily the owner-operators of those housing are small entrepreneurs, small locally based entrepreneurs, and who run it very efficiently, extremely efficiently. And we found, sometimes 1/5, 1/8 of the cost of new construction is what the project cost can be.
Yeah, to see that. Joe, you worked in a very different market, Boston. I mean, Boston's a big place. It's got various challenges, but I think that many of the places you worked suffered more from the pressure of gentrification. How did MHIC and how did you, and what kind of tools did you bring to that beyond the federal tax credit program and the vouchers?
Well, we were essentially a source of private capital, both debt and equity capital, to try to respond to that. But you're right. I mean, certainly in Boston, it is a gentrification problem, not so much a disinvestment problem. I think when we got started in 1990, there was worry about disinvestment in certain neighborhoods in Boston, but that's pretty much vanished at this point. It's all really gentrification pressure. But there is parts of Massachusetts that we work, the Lawrence, Lowell's, New Bedfords, et cetera, where Chelsea, where there is disinvestment still. So there's different markets. I think we've tried to be, we've ventured into the sort of naturally occurring affordable housing. We have a program in Somerville initially called 100 Homes, where they use some local money to try to buy up these homes. And it's been relatively successful, but it was hard because the city money was tied to, had affordability restrictions. Most of the housing that comes in the market, what we did is we allowed a local nonprofit to basically be a cash buyer. This is the program we set up, so they could just go in and compete with the private market, buy them at market values. But most of the housing is occupied. You buy an occupied housing, who's living there right now? Can it qualify as affordable? This becomes tricky, in other words, in terms of accessing this money that the city is providing. So it's a big challenge. And I think it's also true that the Boston housing stock, and Massachusetts in general, most of the multifamily is in very small properties. A lot of triple deckers, a lot of 2 and 3 family homes. And that's certainly where most of the affordable housing that Jack's talking about is. That's where the lower cost housing exists, is in these 2 and 3 family homes, which are owned by either entrepreneurs or somebody who bought the house as a way of helping them afford to become a home buyer. They live downstairs, they rent up 2 units. Yeah. That's a very common typology in the Boston market, and that's a hard market to serve. And I think we're confronting, sort of moving to the challenges ahead. There's an enormous challenge when that housing turns over. Somebody who's owned it for 30 years has kept the rent relatively low. It's not necessarily an evil landlord who's going to come in. It's just the next buyer is going to buy it at a market price, going to have to finance it. They're going to have to raise the rents. It's just a natural dynamic of turnover of ownership. And I think that's a big challenge in terms of trying to confront that. And there's lots of approaches beyond acquisitions. There's things like property tax systems, other things to sort of keep the housing more affordable. But it's, I think, an enormous challenge going forward.
And I think one of the things that I hear so much, especially about working with small developers and small properties, is the enormous amount of TA that's needed to, really set people up for success, right? You can lend them the money, or you could maybe help with the equity. You can do these kinds of things, but it's a lot of TA to try and get somebody into their first triple decker, or now they own 2 and they own 4, and maybe they want to go, build in the downtown Boston skyline after that. So not necessarily staying affordable, but I know that MHEC has been very involved in that, and also, that is an economic development engine, helping these people, do that, but also suppliers, and how that runs through, and who are the suppliers, and how you've sort of broadened your view of that and your role in that.
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason MHIC got started was concerns about racial equity. There was concerns about, there was a Federal Reserve study done in like 1988, saying the banks were underinvesting in minority neighborhoods. So racial equity was sort of embedded in our core values from the very outset. And so we have, through our financing, we've, with all of our partners, established goals for how much of the money is going to go to businesses owned by people of color. This is sort of fundamental to what we do. And so typically, it might be in a Boston project, 40, we sort of work with the sponsor on goals, but typically 40, 50% of the money goes to an MBE, minority business. And over the years, that's resulted in, to the projects, like $750 million of the financing we've provided has gone to MBEs. And we're very proud of that, and we work with a lot of others. Recently, we've, through a task force of the other agencies, worked to have everybody sort of establish similar goals. This last year, the state built into their qualified action plan requirements that the teams have diversity and have goals for diversity. So I think it is, all of us who are in this, in this space, provide a lot of capital. There's a lot of capital. The affordable housing business is a big business.
Yeah.
And it's important that that big business result in capital flowing to and helping to grow smaller, particularly businesses owned by people of color, and that has been an important goal for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that we also lend primarily to local entrepreneurs, and it's slightly different niche than what Joe's talking about, though, because when Joe talks about triple deckers, I think a lot of times you're talking about owner-occupied. And when we lend, it's really not, we have that segmented off like the 1 to 4 units as owner-occupied, and we lend to people that are 5 units and above. It's virtually all, it is all investor-owned housing. And it's private little businesses that these our folks have. Sometimes it doesn't start out as full-time. These guys, the men and women who run these businesses, they can come from anywhere. They can be teachers, plumbers, contractors, real estate brokers, and they start doing this usually as a side job, and then if they're successful, they buy a 6-flat, and maybe they get another one, and after they have a few buildings, then they can maybe start doing it full time. Mm-hmm. And those are the kind of people we nurture at CIC, and I would say they are the best at operating in difficult, challenging neighborhoods. Another distinction I would draw is not-for-profits are great, but and particularly great for maintaining a mission, but not necessarily great at providing efficient hands-on management in challenging neighborhoods. And that is most often done well by local entrepreneurs. And the not-for-profits, to me, end up being more appropriate to own housing in stronger neighborhoods, in neighborhoods that maybe are in more danger of losing housing to gentrification, mm-hmm. where you want to maintain affordability, and not so much requiring the hands-on day-to-day management where somebody could call you at midnight about their leak and
you need to be there.
And you're supposed to do something.
Yeah, right.
Midnight on a Saturday, I might say.
Switching gears here, and I think of great interest to all housers, and I use that as a loving term, is the potential changes to CRA, and what CRA has brought to our communities, and what we might be in danger of with changes. I don't know whether that's too broad a topic, but just as 2 practitioners for a long time in the field to get your understanding of that.
I guess I would say that our relationships with our member banks, the banks who invested with us, has really evolved substantially. When we got started in 1990, I think our member banks would look at the pro formas and they would see all the subordinate debt and They would look at loan to value, and there was lots of questions they raised. How could you have so much debt on a property that doesn't support it, et cetera, and sort of lots of questions about how this all would work. I think over time, I think I think the banks have gained an understanding that affordable housing can be good business, that it works, that almost all of our housing has succeeded. There's very few cases. The LIHTC port, it's a product, it's one of those things which has, stood the test of time. So I think the banks have, changed their thinking in terms as the investors in terms of a penalty that they have to do this because
Yes.
CRA is making them do it, to really trying to understand where they can make impactful investments that are good investments over time. And quite honestly, I think that's part of our mission as a CDFI is to kind of pave the way, is to show this is good business, to always make sure that we're making that case and that we're over time building confidence of investors in this class of investments so that they will see it as ongoing business. And I think most of our bank members, they want to be sure they're getting CRA credit. They want to make sure that what they're doing, they're going to get credit for it. And it's not always been the case that the CRA rules have given credit to things. I mean, for example, small deals you mentioned are really, but a smaller deal is like much harder than a bigger deal, for less money, for less fees, all the rest of it. And there's not given enough credit to the things. It's not measured the difficulty of doing something. It's sort of pure dollar volume and measuring dollar volume, and it's not really a good metric for whether a bank is doing a great job or not. So I think banks want to see that they're getting credit where they feel they should be getting credit. But I think our banks, I maybe shouldn't say this, my successor, Madi Teray, is here, and I'm sure he will be on that. But I think if CRA went away tomorrow, a lot of our banks would continue to invest. And we've got other, we've got health insurers who are investing with us now. We've got other non-bank investors. So I think I think people would continue to want to do it. They want it to be a sound investment. They want it to make sense. They want to make sure it's sustainable. All the things we care about anyway. In other words, this is not things we wouldn't care about. So I think that, again, we want CRA to be fixed and fixed right. But I think that we're less dependent, I guess this is my feeling, on CRA per se, as we have been, as we were 30 years ago.
Okay. With your experience?
I'm not as sanguine, but I have less confidence if there was no CRA. What that would be my doomsday scenario. I don't know what would happen, but I always look back and say I'm very pleased that CIC started in the mid-'70s before there was a CRA, and that's pretty cool. That was 15 banks in Chicago, in Illinois. We didn't even have branch banking. It was all locally owned banks, and it was 15 locally owned banks that got together and saw disinvestment in Chicago communities, and they said, "Wow, look at this! Look what's happening." That was following the late '60s and fires and disinvestment in the city, and they said, "What is going on? If everybody's leaving the city, somebody's got to lend there. Somebody's got to do business there. I don't want to do it by myself, and maybe we can do it together and leverage our risks." And they were able to do that, and that was in the mid-'70s before there was a CRA. And I thought that's so it's the same kind of motivations. Mm-hmm. Somebody's got to do it. Somebody should do it, and it's evolved over time. And as I agree with Joe that, it's just the commitment of the lenders is great. The amount, those lenders that are at our table and how much they're committed to our business and to the neighborhoods, and that this part of the bank, they're not looking to make a fortune on this. They want to have reasonable transactions. But they've also allowed us to become experts in this. We're experts in lending in neighborhoods that they don't have to do it themselves. Every one of them doesn't have to have a business unit and people trained in doing this type of lending in this kind of neighborhood. So there's an efficiency to it too, but they really appreciate it and are committed to it. I would say one of the things I noticed in the near the end of my tenure was when COVID hit, and it was, there was a doomsday coming there because we, in our housing stock, we lent to all these small-scale entrepreneurs who were dependent on income coming from people who were at the lowest for the rents, at the lowest end of the economic spectrum.
Not working from home.
Not working from home. And when COVID hit, man, that was right there, boom, front and center. And it was for a brief period of time, I thought, this is it. This is because if all of our loans went bad, I mean, it was all dependent on cash flow from low-income people. And if they all, that would be the end. We couldn't pay all our creditors and stuff. But I will tell you, everybody came to this with total commitment. It was really interesting to see. One of the things I really appreciated at that time was the value that everybody had for CIC and our role, and how they stepped in and took care of us, in a sense, and helped us guide through this period. So that was very impressive, and that was led by the commitment of our banks.
Heartening to hear.
I think, just to underscore something that Jack said, I think the value of CDFIs in this situation of investors having a trusted partner. We recently did a survey of all our investors, sort of asking them what's important, and I think for them, one of the most important things is having a trusted partner that understands the complications, that is expert in this, that's going to manage it, that's going to take care of it. I think CDFIs really are central to addressing this longer term, because I think there's going to be bumps in the road. There's going to be stuff that happens. It's going to go up and down. Markets are going to change. And I think that the investors want to make sure, the capital sources want to make sure that there's a trusted partner underwriting it, managing over time, bringing people together, other resources together. I think that's really critical.
Absolutely. Well, we've just got 1 minute, so I'm going to ask you both, because you're both chairman of NAAHL and longtime members. How is NAAHL different from some of the other professional organizations you've been in? We talk about banks and CDFIs. We're a mission and banking group. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I joined NAAHL soon after I took the job in 1990, sort of early on. And I think it's different in the sense that there are, both investors and, banks and mission-oriented CDFIs confronting the same problems, we were confronting. In the 90s, that was, Freddie and Fannie, who were dominant at the time. Remember Freddie and Fannie?
Yeah. I do.
They were really important. They were, for us early on in terms of LIHTC syndication, they were 50% of our investment was coming from Fannie and Freddie. And also they were obviously very important on the permanent mortgage. So every coming to organization, whether it was other people who had, stories to tell and had solutions they could recommend, or hearing different approaches here today to these challenges. It's really been an important learning experience. To me, it's obviously the policy advocacy is really critically important, but I've really viewed NAAHL as a place where I'm going to learn what other people are doing, solutions to problems I'm confronting. And I think it's been very practical in terms of its orientation.
Great, thank you.
Agreed with all. It's a small enough organization. It's, small thought leaders. I'd say a small group of thought leaders and practice leaders. And for me, when I would come to these, I could see what the banks were thinking, what the different CDFIs were doing, and get input from all of that and share the experience. Very valuable. And you get involved in a way that you don't get involved in larger organizations, the immediate involvement. And so that's very valuable. And then, of course, with all of that, it's valued by the policy leaders in the country. We get the policy folks that all government leaders all come to the table to talk to us and negotiate for what comes next.
Well, thank you both very much. And we've got a small token from NAAHL to thank you for your service, your long-standing service, and not only your service, but your enthusiasm. And it was just great to be able to have a few minutes with you both.
Thank you, Merilyn.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Merilyn.